All this
All this
slashing and
try
how
and
you
plan
do
B.
it.
Okay.
Cutting
I
and
actually think
ripping.
Brian would
Well,
do
we're
it
good.
probably.
Film
from
Recorded and then I'll upload it after.
Living Dead or whatever
Oh,
that was.
yeah.
Yeah, The Walking Dead. You get fake doom from Al Gore.
Or can we play just the voice?
Well, see, that's where
without
they
the sound?
young people
No,
get their
no, you can't, no.
Okay, all right.
Alright, so we're recording right now.
Oh, okay, so I'll go ahead and start.
Their chair and one more chair.
Good afternoon. We're recording this for broadcast later for technical reasons. I apologize to anyone out there that's expecting to be able to stream this video land or alive. I'm sorry, but we just have a technical difficulty, so we're going to go ahead and start. And my name is Brian Lantz. I'm here this Saturday, April 6th. This is the LaRouche meeting here in Houston, Texas. And I'm going to be speaking on the space program. Right off the bat, I want to put up a slide, which is text. It's the text of some of President Trump's remarks at the press conference that occurred earlier this week.
Not up there, Brian.
That's under the control of Maestro Brian. Is it up there? It's on countdown. Okay, it'll get up there soon.
It's not gonna blow, is it?
So I'll start reading. This is the press conference with Vice Premier Liu Hu of China, and of course this is part of the ongoing trade negotiations. But this was on a different subject, and it's mentioned that it's the 40th anniversary of U.S.-China relations. This came from the press. And President Trump responds. There you have it up there. And I'll just skip down to where it starts with what you have on the screen. And between Russia and China and us, we're all making hundreds of billions of dollars worth of weapons, including nuclear, which is ridiculous. This is President Trump. And I would say that China will come along, and I will say Russia will come along. It doesn't really make sense that we're all doing this. I think we're the leader. I think we're always going to be the leader. We have to be the leader. I think it's much better if we all got together and we didn't make these weapons. So I think that's something that could be a phase 2 after this is done. That is, after the trade negotiations are done. But as you know, China is spending a lot of money on military, so are we, so is Russia, and those three countries, I think, can come together and stop the spending and spend on things that maybe are more productive towards long-term peace. I don't know if I'm speaking out of turn. We haven't discussed this very much, but I feel that, you know, the military expenditure of you, he's speaking to Li Hu, and Russia and us, it's a lot of money could be put to other things. Would you like to respond to that, Vice Premier Liu? I think it is a very good idea. President Trump, yeah, I think so. All right. So this, despite all of the noise, the neocon noise about, you know, breaking up the North-South Korean negotiations, or we can't trust those North Koreans, or invade Venezuela, overthrow the government. You know, this is coming from Bolton and Pompeo and Mike Pence, anti-China, anti-Russia rhetoric. Here we have President Trump just this last week, again asserting an entirely different view that foreshadows LaRouche's new Bretton Woods, that foreshadows the proposal for the four powers. That is, that the United States, China, Russia, and India can lead together, can come together and overthrow the British Empire that's behind Russiagate, has been behind Russiagate, the actual authors, not the Russian hack mime that's out there. But this four powers grouping can come together and negotiate a new financial architecture among sovereign nation states to move the world forward. Now, after the collapse of Russiagate with the publication of the Mueller paper or product, virtually the first thing that President Trump has done is announce a new U.S. Moon-Mars mission for the United States, a revival of the U.S. space program in the tradition of Kennedy. And I want to point out that Dmitry Rogozin, virtually at the same time, had his own comments to make about U.S.-Russia space relations. He said, this is the head of Roscosmos, Russia's space program, I am a fierce proponent of international cooperation, including with America, because their country is big and technologically advanced, and they can make good partners, especially since personal and professional relations between Roscosmos and NASA at the working level are great. He said this last Tuesday. President Trump also has indicated indirectly his willingness to continue to work and in fact expand future work with China as well. Very much you can take it in the context of the remarks at the press conference of the White House. But this is a picture of Bridenstine, Jim Bridenstine, the administrator of NASA, with Zhang Kujin, who is the head of the CNSA, the China's National Space Administration. They met last October. This was in Europe, in the context of the 69th International Astronautical Conference. And Bridenstine was very clear that he was looking forward to, he said it, and so did John, that they were looking forward to cooperation between the U.S. and China in space, and that that cooperation had already begun. So here we have, from President Trump's space directive. This was issued in 2017, shortly after it came into the White House. And I just want to emphasize, no, I'm sorry, this is, let me go on and see. Oh, no, I guess I don't have it. Let me just, before we get to this, what you see on the screen now, the presidential directive from 2017, it's a short amendment to the existing national space policy. The amendment is set far-reaching exploration milestones. And he stated, lead an innovative and sustainable program of exploration with commercial and international partners to enable human expansion across the solar system and to bring back to Earth new knowledge and opportunities. Beginning with missions beyond low Earth orbit, the United States will lead the return of humans to the moon for long-term exploration and utilization, followed by human missions to Mars and other destinations. That was 2017. And now we have the president's new announcement, the statement that that Trump is boldly putting Americans back on the moon. This is from the fact sheet released on March 26th. And I just underscore the second PowerPoint, if you will, there. The second emphasized point. The United States will seek to land on the moon's south pole by 2024, establish a sustainable human presence on the moon by 2028, and chart a future path for Mars exploration. Now that is to put us on the moon within 5 years. It's 2019, 2024, that's 5 years away. This is having the time of the timeline that NASA was working on even a month before this March 26th event. So this is a sudden turnaround, and I want to go through some sense of what this program involves just briefly. But to give people a full sense, you know, of what's involved. We're going there on the Space Launch System. That's what's most likely. Bridenstine said that this is essentially, this is the only option we have. And he was including the possibilities in terms of private launch systems. They'll play their role. But in terms of getting man onto the moon by 2024, the SLS, at this point anyway, appears to be the choice. This is the program that went into effect following Obama's killing of the Constellation program, which would have given us other options. But now we're with the SLS, and if we're going to do it in 5 years, we got to move from here. On the left, you see the Block 1 crew. That's what we're talking about initially in terms of a launch vehicle. Let me just collect my notes here. The SLS Block 1 would put 28 tons into orbit, but Bridenstine is already pointing out, just within really hours of Mike Pence's remarks announcing the new Trump program, the new White House program, that he will need, that they will need Block 1B. A larger system there. I believe it's there on the list. No, it's not. Well, we'll use Block 1A as for right now by way of comparison. It's actually a little larger. I don't know if we have. Shoot. 1A was what was being proposed before the adoption of the exploration upper stage, which is actually a larger stage. So for comparison, you might put it there, compare it to Block 2, which is actually even a larger vehicle, more comparable to the Saturn V, although still a 2-stage rocket instead of a 3-stage rocket. But the exploration upper stage would add the second stage with 4 RL-10 engines, as opposed to the SLS-1, which has 1 RL-10 engine. All of these systems that you're looking at there all basically spin off of the Space Shuttle program, the RL-25 rocket engines that have just been tested. They've just completed the series of testings on a collection of 16 engines. These are engines that are left over from the shuttle program that are now being recycled. There's 16 of them. They've all now been tested. They've all been tested up to 113% of their original capacity. 100% was what they were built for the space shuttle. But these have now all been tested up to 113%, and one of those will go on the SLS-1, uncrewed, around the moon by 2020. And then by 2022, around the moon with a crew, and then as Bridenstine is emphasizing, by EM3, that is by Exploration Mission 3, he's got to have Block B. He's got to have an upper stage with 4 RL-10 engines to give him the power to not only take the space, to take the Orion to the moon, but also to bring cargo to the moon, to begin building the gateway before we send a crew up there to land on the moon. So this is some of what's involved. There you see a break, kind of a what do they call it?
Exploded view.
Exploded view, yes, thank you, of the SLS-1A. And you see there in the upper left, you see the capsule, the second item down. The top item, that's the escape system. If anything goes wrong at any point, including early on in the mission, that upper stage connected to the capsule is powered sufficiently to lift the capsule and the crew away from the vehicle and rescue it. So that's what that top, the needle nose top of that, of the SLS is for. Below that you see the capsule, and below that the power system for it, and so forth.
So
And that's
after-
another view of the that you see there of the service module and the crew module. Yes, go ahead.
After a successful launch, that's jettison to save weight.
Right,
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
and there's a breakaway of the Orion itself, planned for 4 astronauts, men and women, and it's being emphasized that the first astronauts on the moon will be, this time American astronauts will be a man and a woman. Keisha had a chance to sit in the mock-up of the Orion the other day. If you tune in to LaRouchePack.com, Friday there's a wonderful webcast with Bruce Director and Keisha, and included in that is some photographs of Keisha's recent tour there at NASA and the SLS and Orion project. And there, once that needle drops away, here's what you're looking at with Orion traveling towards the moon. As compared to the 50 tons that Saturn V could take to the moon, we're taking 20 tons at a time, and so we're going to have, this is going to require multiple launches because we're going to be getting the gateway up there. The first component of the gateway, that is the unit that will be put into orbit around the moon for the Orion to dock at, will go up, I believe, next year. These things are all in flux right now, but they have to begin going up very soon.
I think
So-
you said 2023.
2020, oh, well, I know it's going to happen sooner than that. 2023 is still, I think, the old plan. Here's the gateway itself. In terms of, on the far right, on your far right, you see the docking of the Orion, and then you have the other compartments for crew, for power systems, supplies, cargo, and on the far left, I believe, is a schematic of a lander.
The one next to the Orion is Russian, right? It's, looks like
No.
it's Russian.
The PTK
It does say so on the bottom.
Yeah.
on the top and the bottom.
Roscosmos.
says-
Oh, okay. Well, this is one of the possible formulations
Yeah.
along the lines. I pulled these obviously off of websites, so this is obviously a dated one. It would be nice to get the Russian collaboration on the
Yeah.
gateway, and perhaps that'll occur. Let me see.
Will they be sending the same one, or is going to be several of these that are going to be going at different times? And
Well, whether the gateway starts going up sooner, which is possible, or in 2023, as Joel mentioned, as the date that's been out there, there'll have to be several. They're expecting that with EM3, this is when Bridenstine, NASA Administrator Bridenstine, is saying he's got to have Block 1B ready to go, his more powerful upper stage. That's supposed to take part of the gateway up then. EM4, if they're trying to crunch it, you can imagine that they might try to take the lander up with a crew, and together it's a single unit. The cargo hold for the Block B or 1B would hold the equivalent of, they say, 3 buses load of supplies. So you could put a lander in there. Right now they're working on the landers. They don't have the lander right now. They've got to have a small lander, and Lockheed's now trying to scale back both the gateway and the lander to the bare minimum to get it all together. But EM4, Exploration Mission 4, could put together a crew, the lander that would reach the gateway, dock, and then have to configure the lander, and then proceed to land. You know, all in a 30 to 90 day mission. Otherwise, it'll be EM5, or there could be additional private launches to the gateway of supplies in between. It's, you know, this is all being worked out. There's a 45-day window, bit roughly from when the March 26th announcement was made. There's a 45-day window in which NASA sent out to its various contractors and so on for, you know, their updated proposals on how they can meet, you know, their contracts on this new schedule, this 5-year schedule, you know, towards putting men on the moon within 5 years. Just on that, they just within the last 24 hours, I assume it was yesterday, NASA announced that they're testing 5 planetary structures for the gateway. These are on land, but 5 different companies are making proposals, and so these are going to be looked at and examined and so forth in terms of designing what ultimately will be the living quarters on the gateway. So all these things are proceeding simultaneous. The testing, final testings of the RL-25 engines, the development of the lander. Doesn't exist yet, and the building of the SLS-1. They've just announced that they've completed the main unit of the first stage has been completed by Boeing with its 4 engines. So that's been completed. So that's being delivered. You have testing of other capabilities, other pieces at Kennedy, going on at the Kennedy Launch Center now. So this is all going on in parallel, and I'm sure it's going to, that kind of multiple tracking is going to increase in terms of the number of tracks that are being carried out.
What is the budget?
I don't have a number on that. Okay. It's right now. Well, here, let me just continue, and this is just obviously a schematic of how this thing has been slated to unfold in terms of the Orion itself. And I think this still had the old timeline. I can't read it from here in terms of when the ultimate arrival on the moon would be. But you have there the kind of a schematic of this process. This is just a comparison, just to show you. Now, is block 1B in there? Can you tell me? But on the far right is well, you can look at them. They're all labeled there. You've got the space shuttle, obviously. You've got the Saturn, I believe. You've got the SLS, and on the far right you have a planned larger rocket that hasn't been built, but is being discussed. A much larger rocket that would be larger than the Saturn V. Comparison of the this is with the R2X engines. This is the block. This is block 2 compared with the SLS 1 in terms of the size. Block 2 is where they want to get to. That begins the rival the delivery capacities of the Saturn V in 2 stages as opposed to 3. In terms of budget, this is this is in terms of percentage of the federal budget, but this is what's happened in terms of the federal budget for NASA. From the peak in the 60s and the collapse as a percent of the federal budget since. Mark?
Is that adjusted for inflation?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
And what they've been trying to do, Bridenstine was saying this just a month ago, I think at the Planetary Society meeting, wasn't it? He or someone from NASA was speaking on this, saying we have to fit the budget of NASA under this.
Dyer,
Yeah, right?
JSC head.
JSC head was saying this, Johnson Space Center head. Well, Bridenstine's saying no, with a 5-year program, we obviously are going to need more resources. We can't do this on the budget that NASA has right now. So as he put it, this is going to require a collective effort, you know, of the White House, but also of the Congress, and bipartisan. And obviously, that means we, the American people, have to wade in on this to get this done.
Okay, and they won't be using more recycled products?
Well, look, I mean, I mean, I'm glad you brought that up. I mean, yeah, we're using the SLS. The SLS is using the engines from the space shuttle. The Orion was actually built as part of the Constellation project, and so that's now that's what's going to carry the crewed mission to the orbit of the moon. The Gateway is being added. That's new, but it's not new in terms of technology. And we're going to come back to that in a minute. There's a lot that's going to have to be done to take the next step, because the point, as Keisha and Bruce were making on Saturday, was we're talking about not just getting to the moon in 5 years, but they say colonization of the moon, you know, a permanent presence, human presence on the moon within 10 years. And so what is it going to take to have a permanent presence on the moon? How are you going to feed these people? You can't, you know, it's not like dropping by, you know, McDonald's drive-in and getting a hamburger. You know, you're going to have food, you're going to have supplies and so forth. You're going to have to solve a lot of problems. We'll come back to that in a minute. The point being here, and this is our emphasis, and it always has been our emphasis, LaRouche's 4 laws, Lyndon LaRouche's 4 laws for the recovery of the United States economy. Starting with Glass-Steagall, the reenactment of Glass-Steagall, to separate out banking, commercial banking from speculation, shutting down essentially speculative banking in the United States. And this would be part of a larger Bretton Woods agreement with other countries as well. Secondly, national banking. We need a national bank to provide credit. Number 3, large-scale credits to finance projects in the national interest and infrastructure, hard infrastructure, soft infrastructure, schools, hospitals, as well as the hard infrastructure of waterworks, transport and so forth, energy, and the funding for fusion energy and the broader science program around fusion energy. These are absolutely critical. Without this kind of effort, we're not going to be on the moon colonizing it in 10 years, much less than going on to Mars by 2033, or sooner, or whatever people want to say. We're going to have to transform the American economy on a scale really more substantive than what Kennedy did with the moonshot in the 1960s. It's going to be a bigger change that's going to be required. So I think quickly I want to reference again Lynn's Strategic Defense Initiative, Lyndon LaRouche's Strategic Defense Initiative, which that was President Reagan's name that he gave to it, which was announced, as many of you know, March 23rd, 1983, which involved an initiative, a crash science program at that time to make nuclear weapons obsolete, as this graphic is showing, to use space-based systems to take out with lasers, with organized high-energy beams to take out ICBMs and make nuclear weapon delivery systems obsolete. That was the initiative in 1983. But it was designed by LaRouche to be a science driver to transform the U.S. economy. And we have some of the products of that today in terms of laser capabilities, among other things. At the same time, LaRouche published his economic textbook with this cover on it of the shuttle going up. So you wish to learn all about economics. And so the point was to educate Americans, or re-educate Americans, on the American system of economics and upgrade it in terms of physical economy, the science of physical economy, to put it on a scientific footing. And we're going to be having a 6-part class series on LaRouche's economics coming up, a national series. This is LaRouche and Reagan during the 1980 presidential campaign in New Hampshire, and of course Reagan with Dr. Edward Teller on your right, who was the key scientist working with Reagan on the implementation of the Strategic Defense Initiative program. And our book at that time, in 1983, on beam defense. As many of you know, the first people to appear on national TV to explain what President Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative was after the March 23rd announcement were representatives of our science foundation, the Fusion Energy Foundation. Now, and Kraft Erica is another key figure that was a collaborator of LaRouche and is key to this whole effort. And here you have a statement on how we should think about our relationship to the moon. If God wanted man to become spacefaring species, he would have given us a moon, given man a moon. In other words, that's what it's there for. To go out further, the moon is the jumping off point. That's from Life magazine. That's a younger Kraft Erica, very well known at the time. And this was designed for a city on the moon. He painted it himself. But you've got to build it. This is LaRouche's design for a city on Mars, which was part of his proposals in the 1986, excuse me, where he proposed that the entire Strategic Defense Initiative program be placed in the broader context of a Moon-Mars program, that had to be the driver overall, and emphasize 3 components to this effort. First, controlled thermonuclear fusion power to be developed. Second, coherently directed electromagnetic pulses. And 3, optical biophysics as the 3 key areas that had to be developed in a crash program for Moon-Mars development, but also in turn that would give us the spin-offs for the Strategic Defense Initiative. And let me just say, I think on fusion energy, at this point I just want to state it briefly. I want to just emphasize, besides fusion energy for spacecraft to get to Mars at 1G acceleration and therefore to get there in a matter of weeks, there is the fusion torch. Absolutely, when we're talking about the moon and we're talking about Mars, we're talking about the need to create the materials with which we will colonize those planets. We're not going to be able to drag them all the way from Earth. They're going to have to be produced. Fusion gives us the capability for isotope separation. We can separate out constituent elements. We can find the elements on these other bodies that will allow us to create the structures we need, the energy we need, the chemicals we need, and so forth. So I want to emphasize that. Secondly, coherently directed electromagnetic pulses, I mentioned. Again, this is critical. I'll just quote from Lynn from his paper, Private Initiative for Colonization of the Moon and Mars, which we're circulating, and it's in the latest issue of EIR. That's just out this week. He says, if we have indicated the general principle of interplanetary colonization must be the availability of technologies adequate to transform any materials and conditions abounding for the landing parties into primary materials of construction. This can be solved by sufficiently high energy flux densities of thermonuclear plasmas, and by focusing such energy into suitable forms of high energy coherent beams. The energy regimes needed are those which enable us, so to speak, to boil and distill any sort of raw material, to transmute some of the distillate, and to create new states of organization of matter. In broad principle, the nature of such requirements is already known, and the feasibility of meeting such requirements in the early future known with sufficient precision to warrant a crash program in related matters. And then on to optical biophysics, and that's what I want to take a little time for today. Let me just stop and first just see if there's questions in terms of the SLS and the space program. That, not that I'm the science nerd or whatever, but if I can help out, I'll be glad to help out. But in terms of having a general concept of where we are in terms of this a new U.S. Moon-Mars effort. Mark?
Isn't it true that at the poles, especially of the moon, we can expect to find water, which would be a great benefit to our space explorers? And also, I believe the moon has abundant oxygen locked up in its rocks. So that's a lot of resources right there, just from a point of view of life support.
Right. You may have noticed that we're going to the South Pole. That's specific to the president's directive.
Right.
And the South Pole, which isn't, it is polar. It's cold. It's not,
It's in the craters.
I know. I'm going to get to that, Joel. No. What's in the craters Joel is referencing is the water, but the poles also are about 70, depending, 70, 80%. There's the Japanese have figures, we have figures, but 70, 80% of the time you have light at the poles. So for solar panels and for light that can be used for other purposes, daylight so you can see, the poles are much better than being where you've got 15-day-long, nights and so on and so forth. So that's a major reason. And then, like Joel was, jumping in with, it's a very important point. That's where we have water in these craters. These craters, the temperatures in them, the Hermite crater is logged in at being minus 400 degrees Fahrenheit. So this is very cold stuff, cold region. But nonetheless, that's why we're going there. The water's there, and obviously if you have water, you have oxygen, H2O. So, so sure, there's that to begin with in terms of resources, absolutely. Yep, Joe?
So the constellation only got as far as engineering, but never anything was built. Was that superior in some respects to the SLS program, or is SLS more advanced?
Well, yeah. I mean, we could go around this, around and around on this. I mean, we are where we are now. So I think Bruce's point that he was really making the other day on the LaRouche Pack website, Bruce Director, was we've got to seize this opportunity. And that was Jim Bridenstine's point as well in his broadcast to NASA employees, that this is our opportunity, right? I mean, this is something we're going to tell our grandchildren about, and we've got to seize it. But Ares 1 and 5, the idea was 1 would take the human beings up, the astronauts up to low Earth orbit. Ares 5 would lift off with the supplies, and they would dock in low Earth orbit and then move up from there. The vehicle would move from there. Orion would leave from there. Now Orion was built, or significantly built, during the constellation program, so that's moved over to the SLS. And a lander or landers were built or almost completed under the constellation program. A lot was wasted, but portions of it were moved over. I would just to say it, it makes a lot more sense to me to assemble a vehicle in low Earth orbit than it is to try to assemble a gateway around the moon. I mean, that's going to be more difficult, and it's going to be limited because you're trying to do it in a short period of time. The gateway can only hold 4 people, so it's not an ISS. It's not a space station. Bridenstine emphasized that the other day. This is not a space station. It'll serve its purpose, but and things can be done there, but it's limited. So it's 2 different approaches. But now we're where we are with the SLS. Other countries could do something different, or in tandem.
Why don't they try to has anybody come up with the idea of simulating this atmosphere and build something here that can mimic that, so they know exactly how to handle
They have that.
building? Have they?
They have that at NASA.
Oh, really? They have
Yeah.
the Mars or Moon?
They do it underwater.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
they have these huge tanks where they can carry out all kinds of activities. They do docking exercises, the kind of docking
That
they'll do.
simulates this.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so while they're doing that, do they learn about the agriculture, how to grow things, how to?
Well, there's
about
let me
life
let me use that to
fish
sachet into optical biophysics.
Well, I just had a quick question.
Oh.
I mean, going back to the moon seems like a far more optimistic thing for the government to be doing than trying to release Trump's tax returns or other Mueller-related garbage.
Absolutely.
But has there been any response from either Democrats, especially, or Republicans in Congress about his proposal beyond what Bridenstine is saying? Is there any?
They're
Is
not
there?
even talking about it on the news.
Yeah, that's what I mean. There's no.
Nothing.
It's not being reported.
Well,
but
this is and this is why it comes back to the American people. It comes back to us. We have to create the groundswell of support for this. At the House hearings, that's chaired by Eddie Bernice Johnson from Dallas, Congresswoman Eddie Bernice Johnson. She was making the point. Well, how much is this got to cost? And we need a budget. We need a number. And Bridenstine was saying, well, we're going to get you a number, and we're going to try to get it you before April 15th, and so forth. But you could see a certain line there, whether this remains her line or not. She was saying, well, I don't see any emergency. There's no emergency now. This is not like Sputnik, the Sputnik era, where we've got to kind of rise up and meet the Russian threat. Why are we trying to do this? Why? So this is the kind of poison that has been used again and again with NASA. And Bridenstine took this on. He said, "Look, this. I've heard it 200 times. Lucy and the football. He talking to the NASA employees. If you know the cartoon, the cartoon with Lucy, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, Charlie Brown, and Lucy is holding the football, and Charlie Brown comes up to kick the football, and Lucy jerks the football away, and of course Charlie Brown ends up in the dust, upside down on his back. Yeah, he said, I've heard this 200 times from NASA people saying, here we are, Lucy and the football again. We're announcing a program, but the money isn't going to be there. The money will be shut down in 1 year or 2 years or 4 years or whatever. The point that, and this is only for starters, it's not sufficient, but the point Bridenstine made was, we've got a president who says he's committing to this in a time frame in which he has a good probability of still being in office. He certainly believes that he's going to be in an office for another 4 years. He is going to be president. So, it's either going to, his reputation is going to rise or fall based on whether he actually delivers on this. And he's put himself in a position of saying, I'm going to deliver on this. It's a good point. It's a good starting point.
Brian?
Yeah.
A NASA scientist who was of Pakistani origin, who passed away, he wrote a paper told me that Mars mission is not feasible because it's going to take 2-3 years, something like that. And by that time, all the astronauts, their muscles are going to be jellos.
Yeah.
It'll be fusion.
And again, this gets us into the area of optical biophysics. Some of you have read the paper, the 1985 paper by Lynn, recently reviewed it. And you might remember that in bringing up optical biophysics, he speaks of Leonardo da Vinci and Louis Pasteur and a shift that's required from particle chemistry to hydrodynamics. And then he says, dear old chlorophyll dimers are among the obvious targets of optical biophysics research, especially as we prepare to colonize the Moon and Mars. This is less exotic than negentropic electrohydrodynamics of DNA and RNA, but not less essential. On Mars, we shall be obliged, at least to a very large degree, to rely upon hydroponics and to supply the plants the energy they require in appropriate doses of selective radiation created by artificial sources from thermonuclear fusion. This shall also require the proper sort of paramagnetic regimes amid their dosages of nutrient. We will need to master the designing and redesigning of chlorophyll dimers to tune their little antenna tails appropriately and so forth. And I'm going to come to that in just a second. And he emphasizes just a little bit later on that this is to get to Mars, you require fusion energy. You've got to have the ability to travel there at 1g acceleration, that is, creating gravity-like conditions. So the astronauts are traveling under Earth conditions. And to do that, you can get there, within a matter of days. You can get there in a matter of weeks, as opposed to months or years. 1g acceleration, you're accelerating at 1g till you're halfway there, and then you're decelerating at 1g. So you're maintaining a 1g gravity condition, but your speed is enormous.
How recent are these coordinates, and when was this math done? And does it match up with the math now?
Oh, the math on fusion rockets and 1g acceleration, you can Google that. I mean, as a potential, that's there. But we don't have fusion energy yet.
Oh, okay.
Right? I mean, again, you were saying, well, what about new technologies in so many words? Well, fusion is one of the technologies we've got to build. Also, a point on this that LaRouche made is that Kraft Erica had designed the programs for building out colonies, industrial processes, and so forth on the moon using nuclear energy. That is, if we have portable, small 20 megawatt, 50 megawatt nuclear reactors, we have them on the moon, we can power what we need, we can do what we need, and so on and so forth. And we can use nuclear explosions for mining and whatever. There's all kinds of potentials. But to get to Mars, it would be like, Charles Bird, building his little settlement there on the North Pole. That's about all you could do with nuclear power. To do on Mars, you've got to have fusion energy for the reasons that we kind of mentioned earlier. You've got to have these high flux energy densities to transform materials, to build structures. I mean, there's nothing on the moon you're going to build structures with, unless you transform it into something useful. You've got to have a lot of energy to create an artificial environment, for planting, for growing, for creating soils, among other things. So that all has to be done. But 1g acceleration is the answer to your question. In optical biophysics, what I wanted to just give a sense of is first what I'm talking about. I mean, first of all, optical biophysics. What are we talking about? Biophysics, first of all, is is the study of biological systems at the atomic and subatomic level. That's what you're talking about. That's biophysics. Optical biophysics is then the study of the interaction of light, electromagnetic radiation, with living matter. That's what optical biophysics is. Lyndon LaRouche is saying optical biophysics is one of the 3 key areas absolutely required if we're going to be able to live, colonize the moon, and likewise Mars and beyond. And what the center of this is, and many of you know this here, is those little rascals, photons, packets, quanta of energy, right? How can I summarize it? At rest, they have 0 mass, but the packets of energy, of light or radioactive radiation, out of which light is composed. Of course, then you get into the particle versus wave theory and so forth. But photons are quanta of energy, and as Einstein said, he didn't even know what a photon was, even though he had helped develop the concept. So a photon itself, let's say that not everything is understood, but we now know, and it's established that photons exist and are very essential to all kinds of processes. And so I'm going to try to give you a sense of that very quickly. Oop. I can't change slides here.
Hit escape.
Hit escape?
Yeah. Okay. Now.
No. Okay. So, I mean, first of all, there's space medicine, right? I mean, this is a low gravity study on, you see a patient down there on the bottom, injured or whatever. Medicine. How do you give medicine? How do you provide medical care, surgery, so on and so forth, under low gravity, 0 gravity conditions? We already know that wounds do not heal as fast. We know that, there's numbers of complications. So Baylor College of Medicine has a whole space medicine program, for example, in collaboration with NASA. So do other portions of the Texas Medical Center. If you don't quite get this idea, this is a gentleman, he's strapped in there, and he's running a treadmill vertically, set up vertically there. And they're testing his behavior and reactions and so forth under those conditions. These are all different mechanisms being developed or already having been developed to work at near 0 gravity. Among other things. So we know about that. We've all heard about the experience of astronauts from the space station, effects on blood pressure, and so forth. So what am I talking about? Well, what is LaRouche more importantly talking about? We're talking about, first of all, the electromagnetic spectrum from light there at 1, a person, to broader wavelengths to the left, and to more intense wavelengths to the far right, on up to.
What's the baseball?
That's the size of the wavelength. They're just giving you an idea, So they're shrinking there, right? And you can see that they're going down to the size of molecules and atoms. And so forth as you go further to the right in terms of their the width of the electromagnetic wave, and of course we've all been exploring this. I mean, electricity and so on and so forth. But we've been exploring the electromagnetic spectrum for a long time. People know obviously about X-rays and NMRs and so on and so forth. What I think I'm going to skip to this one, to photosystems, and this is kind of filling in some background so you can understand what we're dealing with in terms of the Moon and Mars conditions, and why LaRouche is saying what he's saying. This is just to try to give you a glimmer. Photons are the means by which light enters biological systems. Here we're looking at photosystem 1, which is in bacteria and algae, simple forms of life. You're looking inside the chloroplast, like inside of a leaf, for example, the structure of a leaf. And you see there on the far right at the top the entry of light. That is in the form of photons. Okay? As it enters into the pigment tissue, the pigment molecules, which act as a conveyor belt. I mean, this is understood. This is established now. It was less understood in 1986. We know a lot more about it now. Enters into and is transferred to and attracted to the chlorophyll there at the center. This is where LaRouche was talking about those little dimers. Dimer, di is two, and mer is parts. 2 parts. A pair of chlorophylls. That's the term dimer. And from there, the excitation of the chlorophyll results in through vibration into to the production of an electron, or release of an electron, which then is transported into the broader system. So in other words, light is transformed into, in this case, electricity or electrons. So this is, it's like a magical process in which there's a lot of different steps. There's different terms for the parts and so on and so forth going through it. I'm trying to give it to you here as best as I can in a brief overall thing. But I think that the term there at the bottom left, light harvesting complex, it goes right to the point. This is the process. This is part of the process that goes on to ensure living processes. The result of this process of photosystem 1 and 2 is the production, for example, through what's called the P700 photoreaction center, which is that center part there with the chlorophyll and what's called the primary electron acceptor. The P700 center, that's because it's at 700 nanometers wavelength. This is the means for producing producing ATP. ATP, adenosine triphosphate, is found in all living matter, all forms of life. It's a complex chemical, ATP. It's produced by this photosystem process. To give you an idea of its importance, the human body processes every day the equivalent of its own body weight in ATP. Yeah. We, of course, we absorb, we transform energy somewhat differently, obviously, than plants do, through the burning of glucose, oxygen from respiration, glucose, and the production of ATP. But ATP is key to, muscle reflex and action. Virtually every process depends on ATP. So we're not talking about something unimportant here, but it starts in the most simple way in the process that's just outlined here.
That's what Hilton was talking about, the new paradigmer.
The new paradigmer. Ah! If some of you recollect that there was work done by Gurich, a Russian scientist, discovered photons. This was back in the 1920s through very careful experiments and so forth, and discovered the role of photons in cell mitosis, that is the splitting of cells and cell growth. right? The growth of bodies. But now through the photomultiplier tube, where you have incoming photons shown there at the far left, and then the multiplication of that, and then the production at hundreds of times, even millions of times, the strength of a single photon, you can get a measurement. And by comparing these measurements, you can measure these photons. In other words, you're amplifying a single photon into an electromagnetic output in terms of electrons, which is measured there. You see the dial on the far bottom right, right? And I'm just trying to identify that there's an actual process that's involved in measuring this photon process. So let me just summarize what the point I'm getting at without more detail. This process of involving photons, I mean, this is everything. Protein enzyme structures, biochemical reactions of all kinds. Water in the body is not the same as water out there. It's not the same as water that rains. It's dipolar. It has channels through it that transmit photons. Water is utilized in the photosystem 1 and 2s as part of the process. Actually, a byproduct of the photosystems is the production of air, oxygen, not air, but oxygen. So what is the implications of this for life on the Moon and Mars? Well, there's no magnetic field to speak of on the Moon or Mars. There's no magnetosphere. We, but also plant life, lettuce, vegetables, whatever, are not protected, from radiation, cosmic radiation, as well as the radiation from the sun. What is the effect of the changes and the magnetic field in which you're growing plants from that which exists on Earth? We don't know. As you may recall, China's mission to the backside of the moon, the far side of the moon, which is still going on, Chang'e 4, started with the growing of a single plant from a single seed, cotton seed, I believe it was, that sprouted. Of course, then the night on the moon took over, and of course it died. That was, everyone knew that was going to happen. But it sprouted a plant on the moon for the first time. All right, but what happens over time in terms of growing plants? Are they consumable? Will they be edible? How will they change? How do we, as Lyndon indicates in those remarks in that paper, how do we actually intervene to modify biological systems, right, to adapt to those change conditions? These are just some of the features of what we're dealing with. We don't know how plant structures and of course human life itself is going to adapt over time, what changes we're going to have to make to live in these planets, and how much of an environment we're going to have to create. There have been, for example, preliminary studies. I'll call them preliminary. They've used soil from some high desert in Peru. That soil is supposed to be virtually identical to that on the moon, and they planted potatoes. You remember if you saw the movie Man on Mars, wasn't that titled Man on Mars? The Martian, right. He grew potatoes, right, to survive. Well, that was based on experiments that NASA and others have been doing, and they were able to grow potatoes in this soil on the Peruvian, on soil from the high desert. But that was using an LED bulb to give the equivalent of Martian radioactive environment. In other words, it's an experiment, but it's pretty far-fetched. Also on the Mars surface, there's do I have it with me? Maybe. Yeah, I do have. There's a type of salt. I always forget the name of it. Perchlorates in the soil. I'm sorry.
Perchlorate.
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 Perchlorate. Thank you, Joel. Perchlorate. Perchlorates in the soil on the moon, which are poisonous to human beings. So if you simply try to use lunar regolith, to plant your plants in, you're gonna be in trouble. Now you can wash it out of the soil. You can wash it out of the regolith. And if you remember the Martian movie, he used human excrement to fertilize the regolith to create a soil. Well, your excrement has pathogens in it. Your body's getting rid of pathogens. As best as understood, if you grew potatoes using your own pathogens or soil, your own excrement, you would be reconsuming your own pathogens. So that would be, that would be okay. But if you use the excrement of other people or vice versa or whatever, then you'd be consuming pathogens, that your body doesn't have. And so you could end up very sick. So anyway, I'm just saying that these are all elements of what you're going. How are you going to create an actual soil or otherwise sufficient water for hydroponics or aeroponics? That's where you use moist air as opposed to water to grow plants in. Anyway, these are some of the factors. Ian?
Yeah, I remember from astronautic conference I went to a few years ago now. There was a guy who had been developing a vaccine for, I believe it was salmonella, and they were taking salmonella up to the space station, and that's how they were able to identify the source of the poison and then develop an antidote from that. Because what happened is, in the microgravity environment, bacteria and viruses change their activity levels, and notably it became far faster in its growth, much more aggressive in its growth, and much more virulent, much more poisonous in the microgravity environment. Surprisingly so, shockingly so, as he reported. So that is something we ought to take into consideration as well when we're looking at other bodies that, the moon has 1/6 of the gravitational pull of Earth, which is not microgravity compared to the space station, but it certainly is something that we'd have to look at. We also know that, kind of another fun fact, I suppose, to help fill out the discussion is that lunar soil itself is also electrostatic, as is space dust. They're able to, because you can't look visually through to see the structure of the galaxy because of all the dust. The universe is actually very dusty, or galaxy, I guess, very dusty. So, but you can measure it by its alignment. You can look at the magnetic field structure through the alignment of space dust, which follows the field lines.
Okay.
So these are things that when you're looking at the influence of light in the photosystem diagram you have there, who knows what role light could play in organizing and structuring materials from lunar soil or other materials as we have to deal with that. So these are just some other thoughts.
Yeah. So I think that's what I wanted to cover, but I hope that kind of opens a little bit of a window on optical biophysics and some of what Lynn was raising. That it's much more fundamental and at the atomic and subatomic and obviously at the molecular level. That has to be, we need to enrich our knowledge of this whole process. We're going to have to master this. Here, let me just mention, here's some recent papers. Biophoton communication. Can cells talk using light? This is in the MIT Technology Review. Just once again, this is a scientist, Sergei Maburov at the Lebedev Institute of Physics in Moscow, study that he headed up that determined that indeed, quote, a growing body of evidence suggests that the molecular machinery of life emits and absorbs photons. Now one biologist said evidence that this light is a new form of cellular communication. Of course, this goes back to Gurwitch, among others. But this is, this is current research. Northwestern University, researchers discover that DNA naturally fluoresces by a group of scientists there. Quote, this is one of the professors involved in the project, I think it's Blackman. There are textbooks that say biological molecules don't absorb light and don't fluoresce. It's what everyone learns. It's part of the training, so nobody questions it. Everybody has overlooked this effect because nobody asked the right question, and so forth.
When were those papers from?
This is 2016.
Oh, wow.
The last one, the last one was 2012, the MIT paper. Oh, yeah, I was trying to
It's still
determine.
going on.
Yes, it's going on. That,
I
yeah.
thought it had all been like
Yeah,
buried.
no, it's there. I mean, it's
Yeah.
obviously, as these guys are indicating, it's not being pursued as much as it should be, but here it is being published and in journals and so on and so forth. Another piece, biophoton communication. Oh no, that's the same one. DNA as UV light, harvesting antennae. This is again a Russian science paper by a group of five Russian scientists in the Nucleic Acids Research Journal, published in 2018, April of 2018, which is something we were discussing with others, scientists and others, back in the 1980s, was DNA as an actual upshifter of light from ultra. What am I trying to say? The radio wave end of the spectrum up to ultraviolet. This is something different, but nonetheless, the study of how these processes work in terms of wave guides and antennae and so on and so forth. Here's another paper: ultra weak electromagnetic wavelengths radiation as biophotonic signals to regulate life processes. This is out of Switzerland, and in the Journal of Electrical and Electronic Systems. This is from 2014. So this just gives you an idea, and even the National Institute of Health of the United States has a page, an introduction to human biophoton emission. So this is so the work has proceeded. It's there, but it's got to obviously be greatly enriched.
Yeah, I'm just, thinking about how much we have to do so quickly. How much has to be mobilized in the United States in terms of resources, human resources, cognitive resources to accomplish this. And, one of the things it seems to me is that there's a potential, not saying exactly yet how, I haven't thought through how it would be done, but I think, our organizing will play a role, I think, in making it possible. But as we all know, there is an enormous amount of, the university system misfocused on quote-unquote, misfocused the wrong way on environmental issues,
Yes,
right?
global warming and all the rest.
Yeah.
Trillions of
Right,
dollars,
right,
as
right.
Tom Weissmuller
But if you think
emphasizes.
about the potential of getting some of these young people passionate about this environmental science, right? That this question, some of the things you're talking about, cleaning up, how you're going to create a soil, you know, that a workable soil on the moon, right? How are you going to create? I mean, these are things that, you know, could become a huge challenge in the field, these fields that. If the word gets out about this, I mean, we could really see the basis for
Sure, altering, you know, chlorophyll, you know, to live under conditions different than currently, you know, but useful in a useful form for life, for higher forms of life.
But
So,
how to get,
yeah.
you know, these young people who have this passion that's misfocused, and a lot of them, it's not even that they're all that, you know, rabidly anti-technology. I mean, many of them are too young to be that way, right? They're not, it's not like they have any, you know, hardcore, you know, hatred of society or something like that, right? They're just misguided. So, anyway, I'm just saying, I think there's just tremendous potential.
I was just saying
I
to
think that's
Keisha
right.
that I would imagine that they teach some of this at those agricultural colleges that study, and, you know, the development of food and how to do all those things. And I think maybe if someone would come up with maybe a project or a grant and throw it out there, how could we grow food in another atmosphere or climate or something, and you would be surprised at how, and if you throw some money on it, a lot of people might pay off a couple of student loans or grants.
Yeah, these
to
are,
get people interested in that stuff. It's, a lot of these young people aren't just sitting around just looking crazy. They know that this world is going, they're going to inherit this world.
and we know
So
that
they're
can do,
trying to
we
make
did
it
that with
better,
the
but
Kennedy space program.
You've got to
We can
push
do it
something
again.
out there that you don't make people think they're not as smart or they don't contribute a lot. It's up to us. We got to make it where you motivate them and push the button. If you don't,
That's why the
they
NASA
don't have
budget,
time
among other
for it.
things, has to be tremendously expanded. That's why we also need
yeah.
the 4 laws, LaRouche's 4 laws.
Just one quick question. I don't
Yeah.
want you to divert from the
No,
issue.
no.
You said in that movie, The Martian, this guy was using human feces to agriculture.
Yeah.
Is there any way human feces can be refined so that pathogens are in there?
Yeah, it can be freeze dried. It can be, you know, I mean,
Because
It can be treated.
you know, in a densely populated country in Bangladesh, we import a lot of phosphate fertilizers and also urea. Urea is made from, I think, methane, natural gas.
Oh, yeah.
And very expensive, and ultimately we're not getting, I mean, these are not organic, produce. You know, there is always the question that maybe they're not as good for human, you know, the stuff that's grown using fertilizer, synthetic
well,
fertilizer.
you know, a lot of that's fiction. I mean, in terms of that, I mean, the answer to your initial question is yes, but
Human
you know,
can
Ben
be-
Franklin began to recognize the advantage of chemical fertilizers and started promoting it with
That's not,
farmers.
I don't want to get into that argument, but there is you can do it in mass scale. Human feces can be gotten rid of all the pathogens, so it can be used as fertilizer.
Fusion could probably be applied to that.
In a mass scale, because in all the densely populated countries, even in the cities everywhere, that's one thing we are getting,
Well, I mean, there's sewer systems, and there's, we have a modern technology for sewage treatment and so forth.
Getting pure water out of that.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah, a lot of people don't have waste management treatments.
yeah, you need to develop it.
In Grand Junction, Colorado, they're using human waste to power their trucks.
I mean, a broader look. Let's think about this more broadly. I don't have the figures in front of me, but Ben Deniston and Jason Ross put together figures on what would be required if you were actually going to carry out the move to to a manifold, to a platform, an interplanetary platform for mankind. What would it take to actually put together, for mankind as a whole, to boost mankind to the level where we can move out into outer space? Starting with Moon and Mars, but where do you go from there? You've got to lift the entire population of the world up to and above the standard of living that the average American has today. And that's going to require, the equivalent of thousands of nuclear power plants, which is why we got to get to fusion, because we got to become more efficient than nuclear as quickly as possible while we use nuclear. And that's the direction we got to go. Every nation has to have the capability for scientific discovery. LaRouche's point was, look, we've got to massively increase the R&D budget again of our nation, but other nations. But then within the R&D component, we have to increase the component of R&D that's actually going for scientific research in the budget of private companies and as well as government on a vast scale. I'm just saying that this requires global cooperation. Every nation requires a full set economy or something approximate to it. They've got to have the capability to make discoveries and translate it, via the machine, as LaRouche calls it, the machine tool principle, into the economy, into real technology drivers. I'm kind of, I guess maybe I'm going beyond, your question, but, I think it's really important that we not think in terms of, well, how do we adapt to make, what's poor from becoming poorer, and think from the standpoint of the transformation that we've got to make here to move mankind out beyond Earth for permanent settlement of the planetary system and beyond. And that's going to require a transformation that the new Bretton Woods, and the four powers only can make. So we should get on with it, and we should do the Moon-Mars mission to really raise these issues, and get young people absolutely involved.
Well, getting back to the gateway. Getting back to the gateway project. If the Russians come in on that, we're gonna need some collusion on it.
If the Russians come in on the gateway, we're going to need some collusion. I'm just repeating it to make sure that is heard. Yes, indeed, need some collusion.
Well, the 85 report, even Lynn goes through specifically what optics is, specifically trying to tune those molecules that it will benefit us. As he illustrated it, it's on the electromagnetic or electromagnetic dynamics.
Mm-hmm.
So on that, I think that Lynn already identified what is it that we how can we get the science geared up where mankind is actually specifically doing those things where they these systems will operate for the benefit of human colonization.
Mm-hmm.
Because we're not just talking about colonizing these regions. We're also it's really is the standard that we have to we have to now master that, as Lynn always says, that's the crucial aspect of humanity. It's going to be what we have to do out there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so I hope we've given a glimmer into some of that in terms of optical biophysics as part of this. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, I understand the teachings is always based on his ideals, LaRouche's ideals and models. What other people have an input into this way of thinking or developing a new society? And the 4 laws, does he have the second set of laws? If those first 4 don't work, what are the other ones?
Well, first of all, I just
always have a backup.
Well, first of all, I rattled off 4 science papers from scientists around the world working on optical biophysics. so there's all kinds of people.
Okay.
All right, and there's people we're collaborating with and people we don't even know about. You know,
Okay.
look, I mean, China has massive science institutions, thousands upon thousands of scientists working in all kinds of fields. Russia, you know, is noted for its science, has been, you know, since the 19th century, at least. The United States. LaRouche has been in dialogue with these scientists. That was the basis of the Fusion Energy Foundation. It was collectively founded by him and a whole group of other scientists, American scientists, working in a number of fields in fusion research and so forth. That was started back in the 1970s. It's rather, you know, I mean, it is the four laws in that if you don't have an organization of national banking and credit to organize economic growth and development for the country, well, then these great ideas of men and women, you know, go by the wayside, right? You know, LaRouche is a Renaissance figure in that, you know, he worked in all of these areas and played in all of these areas and collaborated with us and collaborated with scientists, you know, around the world. And, you know, these tributes and, you know, accolades and so forth that have flowed in since his death in February, you know, are one measure of that. So I think, first of all, Lynn's role is established. Secondly, there's lots of collaborators around the world. The British Empire is absolutely freaked out that now, under these conditions, with now on top of everything else, a new Moon-Mars mission for the United States, that these great ideas, you know, all this great work by all these people can come forward, and they'll just be swamped.
His laws are the standard, or
they're universal.
They're universal. Good point.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to say with regards to what this gentleman said, I think the right questions with regards to agriculture pertains to the water cycle and nuclear power. I think those two really create the potential for, you know, blooming the deserts, so to speak, or greening the planet, and thus our agricultural output, not necessarily the wastewater issue. But I wanted to ask you about during the Apollo mission, how was it that they were able to get the public and the private working so well together? There was some kind of incentive that was provided to private companies to innovate.
Investment tax credit.
That's well, first of all, there was Sputnik, you know, and so that was a real shock, and that provided an impetus, you know, the political impetus, where you could get Republicans and Democrats behind a program, you know, launched by a Democratic president, or expanded by, it had already been initiated by Eisenhower, but expanded by Kennedy, massively expanded. And there were many features to it. I mean, for students, going back to students, there was the student defense loans, or national defense loans, I guess, if I remember, national defense loans. I think I got a couple of them, if I remember right. You know, that paid, you know, for tuition and lots of other expenses, at least part of it, to get more students, you know, into the college.
Particularly for science and mathematics.
Yeah, right. And sure, I think Belinda mentioned it, investment tax credits. I mean, you had already in the Kennedy period, you had strong tax incentives. Investment tax credits meant that a company that had profits, if they plowed their profits back into expanding, you know, for new technology or training additional workers or upgrading their workforce, they were taxed at a much lower level or not taxed at all. So investment tax credits encourage the private sector to put their money back into growing their productive capacities.
Instead of buying their stocks.
Yeah, yes, instead of stock buybacks and all these games. But there was also, there was, you know, what Lynn identifies in terms of this 1985 initiative, which is, it's titled A Private Initiative for a Moon-Mars Mission. and he calls for bringing together private companies, right, to collaborate, with government. And there was that in terms of with NASA and not only the contracting companies, but with other companies, consultative relationships and so forth. What we now call supply chains and so on and so forth. The companies that were involved in those got involved. Lynn's proposing, look, bring companies together and say, okay, well, look, here, A, B, C, D, E, here are key problems that we have to solve to accomplish, this and this, okay? All right, what can you do? What can you do? Can you devote some floor space? Can you put some of your men and some of your floor space into researching the solution to this specific problem, right? You have these capabilities, can you apply them to this problem? And so that went on with the NASA program, with the moonshot program. A lot of that kind of collaboration, and including with universities, university research centers, and of course the U.S. science centers. So that's not a full answer to your question by any means.
Another thing which I thought, always totally fascinated me was the role that NASA played, that the work that they did, they, unlike these private companies today, is what NASA made as breakthroughs, they put out publicly, published.
Open patents.
They had open
take
patents,
down
right,
pictures.
okay, that's the term for it. So in other words, the breakthroughs could be picked up by any private sector business and applied to their own production process or their own scientific work. And this fueled, key advances in all areas of the country, and the world economy. And that's, what we really need.
Actually, isn't that part of the reason why the Soviet Union collapsed, is because they did not spin off their space and military investments into the civilian sector? Isn't that?
That's right. Absolutely.
That is a principal cause of the collapse.
Can I add
Could you
something?
say that one more time?
That in the early 1980s, LaRouche warned that the Soviet Union was going to collapse in about 5 years, and it collapsed in 6. And he said one of the key reasons for their collapse was the failure to take the technological improvements from their military investments, which would include their space program, and spin those off through applications across the broad civilian sector. And we've had many presenters over the years.
There was no partnership between private and,
Well, it was all under the communist system. It was all state.
everything is owned by state.
But the application, the state did not go under that system and apply those technologies to improve the labor force and its productivity. So the labor force was stuck at a certain technological level, while the military expenditures became so great that it overburdened and blew out their economy.
That's why there's
Yeah,
people
Brian,
walking
I'm
around
just,
hungry.
on that
Let's
line.
Evelyn was asking, let me just,
To answer your question, Victor, partly also, the population was totally mobilized that this was going to happen. Kennedy went to the population, first in his speech in the Congress, then in his speech in Rice. Everybody knew it wasn't just the president's idea, but the whole population. That's what eventually the British put out the Rappaport report and said, we got to do something about this, because the whole population thinks you can solve all these problems with science, and we got to convince them that that's not true, because right now they're convinced, and they're a science driver, to getting something done. And if you think about it right now, how they're keeping the lid on this damn thing, that's the problem we got to help solve, because people have to know when they do get a sense that there is a future with this sort of thing, then they become, the population itself becomes part of getting it done. And we would have a Sputnik of a sort of different nature if people knew that the Chinese were on the backside of the moon.
Brian, just
well,
on
things are
that
getting
line,
stirred up.
just
Go ahead.
one comment or one observation. The Soviet Union makes very advanced warplanes, They're
This
made
Russia, you mean?
Russia,
Yeah.
not Soviet Union. Okay. But they cannot make good airplanes for commercial aviation. They're all the planes they make, they're nobody's using them, any other country. It's because what he said, there's not much cooperation between private and public enterprise.
Well, that's not entirely true. I don't think it's really true at all. I mean, Russia's selling its fighter aircraft to India and all kinds of countries.
Yeah, but not any
Commercial planes.
Well, even the commercial planes, cargo planes, and so forth, are getting sold. I mean, they're not. Look, I mean, China's trying to develop its commercial aircraft industry now. It's a very complex business. It's a very advanced business. Electronically, materials-wise, huge supply chains. It's not easy. So
Boeing is funny.
yeah, that's the other thing. Boeing just
Amazon.
just had to take their planes off the runways, right? The new.
Iran used to use a lot of Russian aircraft, and right now they cannot buy Airbus, they cannot buy
Sanctions.
Boeing, so they're really struggling.
Counterproductive sanctions.
Yeah. Yep, Joanne.
At the end of the day, is it because people want to do this for the expansion and the goodness of mankind, or who gets there first, or who does it first? Because it's always going back and forth, and all the communication is good, but like you say, you have to actually see the progression or the process going ahead. Now, they say if they want to do all this with what? You say 5 years? What was it?
Yeah, 5 years to get to the moon. We'll get that man back on the moon. America.
Oh, okay, maybe back on the moon,
in 5 years.
But that's Mars, I think, is a little.
Oh no, that's 2033.
Yeah.
That's the date that they've been throwing around.
Understand that. So
that might change.
I think we can do the moon.
Okay.
So they should get started.
They are.
That's right.
And then
we should push it.
And like you said, with the education and getting some money, but I don't think they should always keep milking the little people. You got all these rich people. Look at this man, Amazon, that just gave his wife she should have got more than that. She should have got half.
Because the government have invested so much to research the water and energy system on living on other planets. So it's the cost is so high. So if the scientists confirm that in the future human beings can really live in other planets because of the high cost, and is it possible that it will become the privilege of some rich people, because some poor people cannot afford so high cost or to live on other planets. So.
Well, I think, that speaks to the idea of a meritocracy, which China certainly is oriented towards, and it is right now for us a problem in terms of the functioning of our so-called democratic institutions. But as a nation state founded on the principles of a republic. Under a constitution, where our efforts are to be focused on future generations and those around us. We were never meant to be a capitalist country. The American system is not a capitalist system. Alexander Hamilton and George Washington, Lincoln didn't use the term capitalism. It wasn't even, basically it wasn't in their vocabulary. It's, the irony is that, Das Kapital, capital written by Karl Marx, is really kind of not the originator of the term, but capitalism, the use of that term, really is promoted by Karl Marx. And he's there in England, and he's actually analyzing the British economy and the British system, and knows very little about what's going on in America at that time. So there's a certain irony. The term, so what we have to do is restore the American system. The American system is based on the promotion of the general welfare as a real concept, right? And again, that's reasserted itself, as it did with Lincoln, as it did with Franklin Roosevelt, as Kennedy was asserting it again. So this, the solution to the overall question is that we have to put the United States back on its actual principles, right? Not that those principles have ever been fully fulfilled, but we've made progress, and we should make progress again. So as with the national defense loans, all kinds of poor kids, went to college, because of the space program, and similar efforts to get us out of the depression in the 30s, lifted all kinds of people from all kinds of backgrounds into positions, in science and government and all kinds of fields of enterprise. So it's if we revive the American system, which places actually a priority on what some would call meritocracy, valuing, the good that people do over their position or status by birth, then we can solve that problem. And the people that would be living on Mars, or wherever, whether they're from China or from the United States, will be from all kinds of walks of life.
Plus, to enjoy the spin-offs, I remember about 20 years ago, I was on a metro bus, and about half the people were using a cell phone. So to enjoy the spin-offs from the space program, you don't have to be in space. There are not a lot of rich people on metro buses. They all had these little cell phones.
Gas and everything else. You'd be surprised that would be
Work.
Yeah, I think a really crucial portion of actually getting all this stuff done and bringing up the living standards of people across the globe is mobilizing this credit and not allowing ourselves to be straitjacketed by currency and speculation and these ridiculous shell and pea games of the Wall Street cabal and offshore banking institutions and other parasitic warts, basically, of the current financial system. And I'm just wondering how clear is the president's understanding of that? I mean, because it seems to me that that's a centerpiece of the entire enterprise.
Well, I think the approach is, let's take this Moon-Mars program that the president has put on the table and said he's going out to accomplish, and let's use that to get the credit system, the banking and credit system that we need. Because otherwise it won't be financed. But flip it around. Look, we're at a conjuncture of an exploding financial crisis building up again, but also here's this new initiative which cannot be financed, under the current Congress, under in the current mentality that rules the Congress. It's got to be changed.
It
right?
could be applied to healthcare too.
Yes.
Yes.
No,
yes.
it all has to be done.
Yes.
We're going to have a broad transformation, in our scientific fields, to get to Moon and Mars, to actually colonize the Moon and Mars. So where's the financial mechanism for that?
Well,
I'm saying this is going to be on Trump's radar.
All right.
Right? He's going to be bumping up against this, like yesterday.
Right.
And so there's got to be the transformation. So we've got to make him better. We've got to get this done.
If we can't sustain life on Earth, we can't sustain life
That's the
on
same
other
thing I'm
planets,
saying.
right?
Yeah. Fix it down here. I'm gonna go up there with it.
Yeah.
I just don't get it. It doesn't make sense.
So let
Look,
me just
clean this up down
look,
here
the
first.
space program paid back umpteen dollars. I mean, you have for every dollar spent, we got $13. There's all kinds of figures from McGraw-Hill and other people that were published, and we're still getting payoffs from the space program back in the 1960s that aren't even accounted for. So the space program cost us nothing. In fact, it paid us back many times over. So the space program today can do exactly the same thing. That's exactly the point of doing it. It's not a matter of taking from Peter to pay Paul. The point is the space program, as a science driver, transforms the economy, increases productivity, uplifts the population into the future. Permanently. And changes the way they think. You know, optimism, you know, about the future takes over. That's why we got to do it, and we can do it. And it's not, we're not taking it away from anybody. We're creating wealth out of nothing. Out of our minds.
Out of labor.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's real up to
Okay. We'll end on that note.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Yep. Thank you.
Okay, let me just make one.
Yeah,
comment.
sure.
If ever